It's time to go beyond the headlines, cause I don't put in overtime just so I can headline. Okay, now it's Fox Sports, I'm live with Renee. Going hard every day, sports rapping every play. Different segments for your favorites, coming at you daily with positive vibes, yeah, we some game changers. Basketball, football, soccer, with different interviews, you never know who may pop up. Listen, only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington.
Here on Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington this week, joining us to talk about the NBA since we're in less than a month until tip-off, we've got national sports columnist Jerry Brewer from the Washington Post. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Renee.
Now, we have to get right into Bleacher Report's top 50 list that just came out. It's a question that all basketball fans, we find ourselves discussing pretty regularly. Who is the best all time? Where do we rank players? Comparing players across generations. So Bleacher Report came out with a list, left some people a little shocked with some of the players that made the list and some that did not. What are your initial thoughts on the list that has our top 5 at MJ number 1, LeBron number 2, Kareem 3, Magic 4, and Larry Bird number 5? Give us your thoughts on this list.
Whew, I tell you what. Well, it's not worth doing a list unless there's some controversy, right?
Absolutely.
So we have to remember that you're trying to do something that's novel. If you're doing a list that 90% of the people are going to agree on, it's not worth doing. However, let's start with a couple of omissions. You cannot have a top 50 players of all time and not have George Mikan, the first real NBA superstar, on it. The center position has been so influential in the game that the first great center can't not be on it. I know when you look at some of the grainy photos, you're like, man, the game has evolved so much. How would he translate to today? You can't do that because there's going to be a time in which, and Renee, you and I won't be around for this time, but there's going to be a time in which some dudes look at LeBron and say, y'all really were like that crazy about him? There's going to be a time when, believe it or not, like MJ has aged incredibly well, but there will be a time even with Michael Jordan. We're talking probably 100 years down the road, we'll be long gone, in which people are like, really? I mean, you guys were so infatuated. People were so infatuated with him historically. So you got to remember that. But Mikan absolutely has to be on the list because of influence. And I'm going to give you another guy because of influence has to be on this list. Not to mention he was a hell of a player. Allen Iverson cannot be out of the top 50. There's just no way. There's other guys. We can debate the Carmelos and the Tracy McGrady's and all those guys who were left off. He would be on my top 50, but we can even debate the Dominique Wilkins being left off the list. But you got to have Mikan and you got to have Allen Iverson. Guys today are following Allen Iverson's script. And the evolution of the NBA, a lot of it you can point back to some of the things that Allen Iverson was doing that was kind of counterculture back then. Now they've integrated it into the game in a special way.
Yeah, that's a great point. And honestly, he was one of the names that definitely came to mind right away when I saw the list, because you look at some of the players that are on there, Pau Gasol and Manu Ginobili too, that come to name right away. And there were some others that I was just kind of like, how do you put them above AI with all the influence he had? And even AI tweeted out this long tweet, and he listed his resume basically. An MVP, has an MVP, 11-time All-Star, 2-time All-Star MVP, 7-time All-NBA. The list goes on. It's a very long resume because he should be on that list. You look at the influence he's had over the game. You still have players across sports doing the AI step over when he stepped over Tyronn Lue. You still have players rocking the cornrows and headbands, and the first thing you think of is AI. And across all ages, across all generations, he somehow is impacted. Even if it was his practice rant, whatever it is, he keeps people talking about him. And then aside from his actual cultural influence, you talk about his stats and his influence on the game as a smaller guard to be able to do what he did to lead the Sixers to an NBA championship. Yeah, you've got to have him on the list. And
if there wasn't any Allen Iverson, you're talking like Steph Curry wouldn't be the creative genius that he is. Russell Westbrook wouldn't be who he is. As much as we try to compare LeBron to Jordan or Kobe, his guy was Allen Iverson. You know, he'll be the first to tell you that. And so it's kind of the blurring. It's funny because Allen Iverson was so little, but he was a huge contributor to positionless basketball in that he was just a guard. And when he got with Larry Brown, and even though they butted heads from time to time, he and Larry Brown created something genius in just letting Allen be Allen. Sometimes it was as a point guard, a lot of times it was as a two guard, and you just let him go. And over the last 15 years, teams have really loosened the reins on what a point guard does, what a two guard does, what a small forward does, what a power forward does, what a center does. And a lot of it goes back to that and the great experiment of maximizing Allen Iverson. The numbers are there. The influence on the game is there. And not only, Renee, would he be in my top 50, he'd be in my top 30. Yeah,
honestly, that's the hard part. It's not even like he just missed and he's 51. No, he's undoubtedly one of the top 30 players that ever come through the league. And I know that they were, this is, as you mentioned in the beginning, when you have a list, it is a person's opinion or whoever's involved in creating lists. It's their opinion. They're looking at stats. They're looking whatever the criteria are for that. But in terms of, in my opinion, the top player when I think of it is who's someone that all ages can think of. Who's a player that if you're a 5-year-old kid or a 55-year-old adult, that in the conversation you'd bring up in your argument. And I would not think Gasol. I would not think, like some of these names that are on the list, I wouldn't off the bat think, they've got to be in my top 50. And then I even look at the list in itself and I'm like, he's got Isaiah Thomas at 47, Dr. J's 22, Kobe's 14. I know it's hard to rank players because we are talking across, generations. Some of these guys didn't get to play against each other, or they played against each other when one was in the later years of their career and one was younger. So it is hard to compare because the game has changed. But are there any names on the list for you that really stood out that were like, whoa, they're way too high or they're way too low in their ranking?
Isaiah Thomas and George Gervin.
Yeah, that was the first one.
You're talking about, I think they were 42 was Gervin, somewhere in there. Allen Iverson at 47. Isaiah Thomas is kind of funny because Isaiah Thomas and Allen Iverson, there are some similarities in sort of their style. But I once had an argument in a hotel lobby with about 6 guys in Los Angeles.
Oh, God.
And my argument was, this was way back in the Shaq and Kobe days. So right around about 2003. And my point was, Isaiah Thomas is one of the top 20 players of all time. People don't want to give him that credit because they feel some type of way about the bad boys. And Isaiah being the ringleader there and all the rivalries that he had with people. Now, that was 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And so there's some evolution that has occurred, and still, I think he goes somewhere between 25 and 32 is kind of recognizing who he is. And he's also someone who, he had his career shortened by about 3 or 4 years. So you think back and you're wondering, if not for injury, how many more numbers could he have put up? And then also, he's someone that I greatly respect because he streamlined his game to make the Detroit Pistons a championship team. He could have been out there getting 23 points and 12 assists a game, dominating the ball. He had earned that right. And when the Pistons got good, when you started to see, let Joe Dumars get his, let Vinnie Johnson get his, let Bill Laimbeer get his. We got Rodman, we got Sally, we got James Edwards. Later on, Mark Aguirre and Adrian Dantley, then Mark Aguirre. he just kind of let them do their thing and was incredibly unselfish, and his numbers went down to about 18 points a game and 8 assists, but he did that to win championships. And he is a product of what I still consider the greatest era in NBA history, and it's amazing what those guys were willing to do to compete, whereas you see certain guys now, if you told Russell Westbrook, hey, instead of this triple-double standard, we need to cut those numbers to about, 17, 18 a game. You don't need to get 12 assists. You don't need to get 10 rebounds. I mean, he'd have a heart attack. He would ask to be traded before he even played a game with the Rockets if Mike D'Antoni asked him to do that. So you got to give him respect there, and you can't just look. We got to respect the numbers because that helps you helps you be transcendent. But you also have to look at the impact in the game and the impact on winning.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference between, and you know this, there are the personalities that are more into analytics. Oh, well, they had, X amount of efficiency rating, and this was their, points per minute, all types of stuff, versus those of us that really just watch the game for the game. I even get into an argument with people that compare LeBron to Kobe to MJ, and I'm like, well, yeah, okay, championships is definitely an argument, don't get me wrong. But look, it's more than just stats that you bring to a game. It's more than just, how many triple-doubles did you have? How many career points did you have? LeBron's got over 30,000 points, 8,000 rebounds, 8,000 assists. Okay, but what else does he bring to the teams that he's on? These are the types of things, to me, if I'm looking at a top player, it's someone that every team they're on, they raise the level of that team, whether it's through their own stats or getting players around them stats. Getting their team to, getting their team to championships, to playoffs, helping a team go from being one of the worst in their conference to the best in their conference. These are things that make a leader. So when you look at players like Isaiah Thomas, okay, you might look at his numbers and say he's not a top 20 player, but look at his impact on the game. The Bad Boy Pistons are still one of the most talked about, that era in general, as you mentioned, being I agree, the best in the NBA ever. The Bad Boy Pistons are in the conversation because of Isaiah Thomas. You can't get it twisted and think otherwise. So I do think part of the criteria and the discussion of rankings does come down to the fact that, are you an analytics person or are you a basketball first fan where you're looking at impact versus numbers? And the two don't always go hand in hand. So I agree
Absolutely.
with you on that.
And your age plays into that. We're either prisoners of the past or we're prisoners of the present. And too often, both sides need to take a step back and give equal weight to everything.
Yeah. And I think with AI specifically, that's probably something that a lot of people overweighs, the fact that once he left the Sixers and, he was with Denver and his career was in its decline, he wasn't as good. But you can't take away from what he did in the beginning of his career in the 90s, the 2001 Sixers getting to the finals. You can't take that away from him because he got older.
No.
And not everybody ages and can continue to play the same level. Look at what MJ did in his later years when he came back from baseball. You got to look at in their prime years, what were they like? And then yes, you can also look at the longevity. So I think that is also something that has to be taken into consideration, but don't put too much weight on those last couple years. Kobe in his final year, you can't take that for what his entire career was. So
Sure.
We have had a recent ESPN ranking that came out with their usual predictions of who will be the better player this upcoming season. So this is a prediction for the upcoming year, not a list of all-time current players. So that's a distinction in itself. But from that list, we did have the Greek Freak, Giannis Antetokounmpo at number 1, Kawhi number 2, LeBron 3, James Harden 4, Anthony Davis 5, Steph Curry 6, Nikola Jokic number 7, Joel Embiid 8, Damian Lillard number 9, and we had at number 10 Paul George. So What are your initial thoughts on this top 10 that came out for predictions for this upcoming season?
Well, I think it's going to be hard for Paul George to live up to number 10 this season. And it's not because I don't love Paul George. And, he's just a fantastic two-way player coming off of a career year. But, having the surgeries on both shoulders, he's likely going to miss a month of the season. And it could take some time for him to adjust after that. He's on a better team. He's not going to need to score 28 points a game like he did a year ago. I see him maybe being a little bit further down that list in terms of what type of season he had. I think he's more of a lower end of the third team All-NBA type guy this year instead of a first teamer. But that has nothing to do with what I think of him as a player and what I think of him and what he's going to be, come April, May, June. It's just a matter of I don't know if he's going to put enough games together to be, all in all, a top 10 player in this regular season. And that's kind of how I look at the NBA rank. So I start there. I think it's the league is just so dynamic, and I think Jokic is a really good player. I think for Denver to take another step, I'm not sure like the seventh best player in the league is right where he should fall. I think maybe he might be, 4 or 5 slots down, and you sort of elevate Jamal Murray a little higher, and that's their big thing. Is they got to have more star power. They got all the other stuff, but the reason that Portland beat them in that Game 7, they got Dame Lillard and they had C.J. McCollum, and McCollum made a big play right there at the end, and they get beat. And so they need to kind of spread the wealth. He's an unorthodox type of star, and that he's not going to score 25 points. I love his game, but I'm not sure he's exactly 7. I think that Steph Curry, in his current situation, KD's gone. Clay's going to be out at least half of the season. Everybody's starting to doubt the Warriors. They have to do it differently. I think he's going to go off this year. So I think 6 is incredibly low for him. I really do think that if he can stay healthy, if he can put 70 games to it, which he's had trouble doing at times the last 5 years, but if he can play 70 games, the numbers he's going to put up are tremendous. And I think he might have another 30-point season in him like he did during his unanimous MVP season.
Yeah, I definitely think you make some great points. Paul George, it is a question of health because a lot of people, again, this goes back to your awareness of the game as a whole. You can't expect, I don't care who the player is, to be able to come back from a surgery, the rehab and PT from it, being out, being unable to practice at the highest level like their teammates are, unable to play games, and then come back into the season at a time where, once we get into this December month and January time, everyone's kind of hitting game shape, game peak. Those early months, it's still like a preseason in a sense. Teams are still figuring things out. But you start to get to the middle of the regular season, December, January, February, that's when you really see teams taking form. So to come back in that time, that is tough for anyone, regardless how good you are. So you do have to take into account he's coming back off of surgeries, off of being injured, off of, not being able to have a full schedule of preseason and training, doing the same regiment that his teammates are doing. But in terms of Steph Curry, I think a lot of people do forget who Steph Curry was before KD. Steph Curry, when they were the Splash Brothers, and him, Clay, and Draymond Green were, leading the Warriors, and they didn't have KD. They were still breaking records with their 73 wins. They were still a championship team. They were still the best team, and that was still a Warriors dynasty. So I do think without KD, we still have Steph, but without Clay, he even is going to have to elevate his game to a whole different level of what we saw Steph Curry as with the Splash Brothers, because he doesn't have another Splash Brother. So I'm curious to see how that is going to go, because we have, I've been anti-Warriors because I've been tired of watching them win. So, I've been kind of I've been against them and wanting to see them fail as a true hater that I am, and I can openly admit that. So I'm curious to see how is he going to be Steph throwing his mouth guard and throwing tantrums, looking more like Riley Curry on the court at times, or is it going to be Steph dropping 30 points, and just lights out? So that's a good question mark. So you agree with Giannis, Kawhi, number 1 and 2?
Yes, I do. A lot of people seem to me to be down on Giannis because Kawhi owned him when they put Kawhi on him in the playoff series a year ago, and it really exposed some of the things that the Greek Freak doesn't do as well, particularly just being able to have a reliable jump shot to take some pressure off attacking the rim. His game has to continue to evolve. I mean, there's no doubt that as a shooter, he has to get better. I'd like to see him be a little less ball dominant, and we'll see if they've got the team that can handle that. I mean, and by that I mean that they depend so much on his ability to create shots for others. But it would be nice if some of these other guys, Eric Bledsoe, Chris Middleton, others, who kind of expand their game and take some of the pressure off him so that he's not always just going right at the defense. And so I think that can help him. But, yeah, I think he deserves that crown right now as the best player in the game. It's such a fleeting thing in the NBA right now because there's LeBron, who's the best player of his generation, and then there's who's right there knocking on the door, and James Harden, who's just this fantastic scorer. If he can put a little more balance and some winning behind it, like they had won 2 years ago. Anthony Davis is really primed to break out now that he's playing with LeBron, and LeBron says that the offense is going to run through Anthony Davis, and you already know that the defense is going to run through him because he's a dynamic player. So, when we talk about it at the end of the year, it could very easily be that Anthony Davis is viewed as the best player in the game. And obviously Kawhi's consistency, I still don't believe that he's going to go from 60 games to just all limitations are off. So I think there could be a bit of a difference there. I mean, especially if they play well, you want to limit him to as few games as he can. And that's just that's Kawhi's style of play. When you really look at him as an offensive guy, he absorbs a lot of contact. It reminds me of a bigger Dwayne Wade and his ability to he just gets in there and he throws his body without caution sometimes. And so there's that with Kawhi. I also think that, if you're going to be an MVP, you're going to have to average usually in the mid to high 20s. That's just the way the league is right now. If I look at this Clippers team like I looked at Doc Rivers' team when he got Ray Allen, Kevin Garnett, and Paul Pierce together, and they won that championship in 07-08. Those guys were so good and dynamic. They were good offensively. They were great defensively, and all those guys' numbers went from the mid-20s to the high teens. And the Clippers are a little different. They're built around 2 stars, not 3. But I think we have this expectation that, Kawhi's going to come in and get 20, 28, 27. Paul George is going to get 25 to 27. I don't think that's the way they're going to do it. They got Lou Williams. They got Montrezl Harrell. They're a much deeper team. I mean, defensively, they got the potential to be outstanding. And offensively, there's so many guys who can put the ball in the basket that I wouldn't be surprised if Kawhi is more like a 22, 23-point guy this year. And with so many guys putting up so many numbers in the league, while Kawhi clearly would be in the top 5, he may not put together the numbers to be the MVP. And to be the MVP, it's not just about who's better. You have to put a narrative behind it. And sometimes, James Harden's going to average 35 again, and if Steph is going to go back to the old Steph, then it's going to be harder for a guy to put a narrative together.
I got you. No, it's a great point because of the fact that I think a lot of people get caught up in, well, Paul George averaged X amount of points last season and Kawhi averaged X amount of points last season. So together we're going to add those numbers, and now they're going to bring the same numbers to this team. That's not always how it goes because of the fact that, as you mentioned, when the Celtics had that awesome big three of Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen, and Paul Pierce, you have to change your roles, and that's what they were able to do as a championship team in 2008. You can't come in and you do have and play the exact same way. You do have to change something. Russ and James Harden, it's the same thing. How are they going to adapt to still be able to get the most out of their playing, maximize their playing on the court, but still be able to get up numbers that make sense, if that makes any sense at all. It's an adjustment.
Absolutely.
You're not coming in. You go from being the number one guy. If you were Russell Westbrook and you were the number one guy for the majority of OKC, and Paul George, of course, was there with him, but now you go to a new team playing with someone else that's an all-star and one of the best ever to come to the game. You have to adjust your game around that. And I do think Kawhi and Paul George will work well together. They both seem like, they share the ball really well. They see the court well. They're very dynamic two-way players. James Harden and Russell Westbrook's a question mark for some people, but in my opinion, they're championship hungry. So I think they're going to put aside, being 30, 35-point, triple-double type players to figure out what's going to work best to be able to win a championship. Same thing with AD and LeBron. So I do want to see, and I'm very curious to see, how all these matchups where we have so many teams with two of the best players in the league or the best players to ever play in the game on their team, how's that going to shake out? So in terms of an MVP race or a top player in the league race, it's even hard to predict at this point because the East versus the West is a whole different comparison, let alone within each conference. Now, the East is significantly weaker than the West. We can just say that. You look at the players that are in the West versus the East. And now you look at, okay, how's their team going to shake out with all these changes? We don't know. That's the beauty of all.
I tell you what, Renee, I think one of the themes of this season, so like last year, we talked a lot about guys just kind of resting, doing the Kawhi Leonard plan, and just making sure their bodies were right. I think this year, statistical sacrifice is going to become a theme. There's a lot of, instead of it being, one superpower that's got 4 all-stars like the Warriors, which you wound up hating. I think the fact that it's 2 guys in every situation, James and Russ and LeBron and AD, and the list goes on and on. I think it's easier for 2 guys to get together and to say, you know what, let's just play off of each other. And I think LeBron, first of all, I think Steph and KD helped lead this because they both took a shave to win.
They definitely did.
Both of those guys could have scored more points, and I think LeBron is going to tone down some of his freelancing on offense to help Anthony Davis, and I also think you're dealing, and so I think that's going to lead a movement. And I also think you're dealing with a bunch of guys that can do more on the court. Kawhi and Paul George, for instance, they can do anything. They can go out there and they can run the offense in certain situations. They're fantastic defensive players. They can score with the ball in their hands or in catch and shoot, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, their games are just fantastic. And a lot, when you look at all these combinations, except for James and Russ, you've got these guys that just have this array of things that they can do outside of dominating the ball. And I think that's going to lead to some level of sacrifice. And so I don't know if, for all the stars, if some of the numbers are going to be quite as high, but I think the impact is going to be tremendous. And then circling back to James and Russ, I do think they've got a serious ego about people think that we can only play a certain way. We're going to tone down some things just a little bit and show you a different dimension. And so all these guys play copycat with each other, and they play follow who's the leader and all that. And I see a big year in which all of these tandems work in an interesting way, and we actually wind up thinking about the tandem more than the individual star. And that's just going to make the MVP race even crazier.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited. Less than a month. So, Jerry, thank you so much for joining our show this week to get into these lists that are coming out and rankings, because it is always fun to just get into. There's no wrong answer. Well, there are some wrong answers, but as long as you have certain players, like with the all-time list, you got to have MJ and LeBron somewhere in that top two. But it is always great to be able to hear opinions and thoughts on lists, whether it's the current players or all-time list. So thank you so much for joining the show. Where can our listeners follow you on social media?
You can follow me on Twitter at Jerry Brewer, and on Instagram it is Brewdown, kind of like the rapper Drew Down. Brewdown, BREWDOWN.
Nice, Brewdown. I like it. Well, thank you again for joining the show. I appreciate you weighing in on your thoughts on the list and rankings that have come out in these last week or so. All right, thank you.
Anytime. I feel honored to finally be a guest.